this video, we're going to look at outputs, choke groups, panning, and effects. The S2400 has 16 voice polyphony, meaning that up to 16 samples can play at the same time. That can be 16 mono samples, 16 stereo samples, or any combination thereof. The tracks containing the samples are connected to 8 output jacks, which in turn are connected to a stereo bus labelled Mix Out. And so if you plug cables in there, all of your outputs will be heard. The output jacks are switched, so when a plug is inserted into an output jack, that signal is mechanically disconnected from the Mix Out. Mono samples play out of one of the 8 outputs, so if you set a track's output to 1 in the track settings, that track will play out of output 1. If you assign another mono sample to a different track and also set its output to 1, then this track will also play out of output 1. Whilst there is no limit on how many tracks can be assigned to one output, the maximum number of samples that can play at the same time is 16. Stereophiles work slightly differently. The 8 outputs work as stereo pairs, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and 7 and 8. A stereo sample assigned to a track will use 2 of the 8 outputs. So if you set a stereo track's output to 1 or 2 in the track settings, that track will play out of outputs 1 and 2. If you set another stereo track to play out of output 1 or 2, then this track will also play out of outputs 1 and 2. This does not change the polyphony. The maximum number of samples that can play at the same time is still 16, whether they are mono or stereo. A note: from any track settings menu, you can choose whether a stereo sample is output in stereo or mono. Whilst we're in the track settings menu, let's look at choke groups. This means that if 2 or more tracks are assigned to a choke group, each new event will choke or mute any earlier events that are still happening. By far the most common use of a choke group is to assign an open and closed hi-hat to one so that the two sounds affect one another. However, there are no rules as to which combinations of sounds that can be assigned to choke groups, so it's not only for hi-hats. When you assign a track to a choke group that has other sounds assigned to it, an exclamation mark will appear next to the group number to make you aware of this. Panning. If you're not hearing your stereo samples playing back in stereo through the Mix Out, then this is because we need to set up our panning. To do this, press Shift and Pan, and then use the 8 faders to set the panning for the 8 outputs. You can also use the encoder or arrow keys to do this as per normal. To save time, there are a series of shortcuts listed in the Help section that quickly pan or center individual outputs or multiple outputs at once. So if you have samples playing out of only one speaker or in a position in the stereo field that you weren't expecting, check the pan settings. There are various ways to combine individual outputs and the Mix Out. For example, if your melodic and harmonic samples were on outputs 1 to 3 and your bass line was on output 4, you could connect up those 4 individual outputs to record those discreetly, and then take all your drums and percussion from outputs 5 to 8 together from the Mix Out. So in that example, 8 outputs would be recorded onto 6 within your DAW. You can also use this technique to connect individual outputs to their own effects rather than having them across the stereo output. So it's not an either or, you can mix or match to your requirements. Next, let's move over to Effects, which affects the outputs. To access it, press Shift and Effects. At the time of recording, there are analog filters available in the effects settings, but there may be more options in the future. Use Enter or the encoder to unfold the accordion menu, and you'll see that there are 6 output filters available, and you can individually switch them on or off. These work like the classic machines of the 1980s, so they're part of the retro sound that we covered in an earlier video, but let's discuss what they actually do. The first 2 filters, available on outputs 1 and 2, are dynamic filters. These are SSI 2144 low-pass filters that are opened with a simple RC, resistor capacitor envelope. The resistor value defines the release time and it cannot be altered. When opened, these filters reach 13 kHz, which is the matching Nyquist frequency for material sampled at 26 kHz. So this matches how samplers were in the 1980s due to the limitations of digital audio at the time, and it's included on the S2400 to enable you to capture that sound. However, unlike the 1980s, you can sample at 48 kHz and 16-bit and have the full frequency range by not using any of the input or output filters on the S2400, so the best of both worlds. Outputs 3 to 6 have fixed filters available. As the name suggests, these are low-pass filters with fixed cutoff frequencies that cannot be altered. These filters are op-amp filters rather than the 2144s used for the dynamic filters. The cutoff frequency of each of these filters is different. Output 3 has the lowest cutoff and output 6 the highest. Output 7 and 8 do not have any filters available. In terms of application, the dynamic filters work best for rhythmic material like drums, and in general the filters are really there for material sampled at 26 kHz that's been pitched down using the classic audio engine to give you that old school sound. But there are of course no rules, you can use them as you see fit. And that's everything you need to know about outputs except USB audio, which is covered in the next video.